November 1620. A small wooden ship crashed through freezing Atlantic waves, its passengers huddled below deck, sick, starving, and terrified. They'd been at sea for 66 days. Half of them were already dying from disease. They had no idea where they were going. Their maps were wrong. Their supplies were running out, and the land they were sailing toward was already home to millions of people who had absolutely no idea their entire world was about to be destroyed. This is the story they don't want you to know. The real story of how America was colonized. Not the sanitized version you learned in school with pilgrims and friendly Indians sharing turkey, but the brutal, shocking truth about genocide, biological warfare, stolen land, and the systematic destruction of entire civilizations. What really happened was so much darker, so much more complex, and so much more relevant to understanding America today than anything you've ever been taught. By the time we're done, you'll understand why Christopher Columbus was actually a monster, how European diseases killed more people than both world wars combined, why the pilgrims would have died without indigenous help, and then repaid that kindness with massacre, and how the colonization of America was one of the largest acts of genocide in human history. And here's the part that will really shock you. Much of it was intentional, calculated, and celebrated at the time. If you're ready to learn the real history, the hidden facts that textbooks glossed over or completely ignored, then hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you see American history. Let's start at the very beginning, and I promise you, nothing about this story is what you think. The first secret: America wasn't discovered in 1492. It wasn't even discovered in 1620. Human beings had been living in the Americas for at least 15,000 years before any European ever set foot here. By the time Columbus stumbled onto Caribbean islands, thinking he'd reached India, there were somewhere between 50 and 100 million people living across North and South America. That's more people than lived in Europe at the time. These weren't primitive savages living in the wilderness. That's the lie we've been told to justify what happened next. The truth is that indigenous Americans had built sophisticated civilizations with massive cities, complex governments, advanced agriculture, extensive trade networks, and cultures as rich and varied as any in Europe. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois, had a democratic system of government that would later inspire the U.S. Constitution. The Mississippian culture built Cahokia, a city near present-day St. Louis that at its peak had more people than London. The Inca Empire in South America had roads, bridges, and architectural achievements that rivaled anything in Europe. But you weren't taught that, were you? You were taught that America was an empty wilderness waiting to be civilized. That's not history. That's propaganda designed to make what came next seem acceptable. So let's talk about what really happened when Europeans arrived. Christopher Columbus. They teach you he discovered America. They don't teach you he was a brutal colonizer who enslaved, tortured, and murdered indigenous people on an industrial scale. When Columbus landed in the Bahamas in 1492, he met the Taino people. They were friendly, curious, and generous. Columbus wrote in his journal that they would make fine servants, and with 50 men we could subjugate them all. And that's exactly what he did. Columbus forced the Taino to search for gold. Every adult was required to bring him a certain amount of gold dust every 3 months. If they didn't, he had their hands cut off and let them bleed to death. He sent thousands back to Spain as slaves. He allowed his men to rape indigenous women and girls. When the Taino resisted, Columbus had them burned alive, fed to dogs, or hanged in groups of 13, which he said honored Jesus and the 12 apostles. Within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, the Taino people were functionally extinct. Millions of people wiped out. And Columbus was celebrated as a hero, given titles and wealth, and his legacy was taught to school children as a tale of brave exploration. That's the first hidden truth they don't want you to know. The colonization of America began with intentional genocide. But here's the thing. As brutal as Columbus was, something far more deadly was spreading ahead of the European colonizers: disease. This is where the story gets truly horrifying, because what happened next was the largest loss of human life in recorded history, and most of it happened before colonization even really began. Europeans brought with them smallpox, measles, typhus, cholera, and other diseases that had circulated in Europe, Asia, and Africa for thousands of years. Europeans had developed some immunity through generations of exposure. Indigenous Americans had no immunity whatsoever. None. When these diseases reached the Americas, they spread like wildfire through populations that had no biological defense. Entire villages would be wiped out in weeks. Sometimes 90% of a community would die. The death toll was so catastrophic it's almost incomprehensible. Conservative estimates say that European diseases killed 50 million indigenous people in the century after Columbus. 50 million. That's more than died in World War I and World War II combined. Some historians think the real number was closer to 90 million. Think about that. 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas may have died from disease in just over 100 years. Entire civilizations collapsed. Languages disappeared. Cultural knowledge was lost forever. Cities were abandoned and swallowed by forests. By the time English colonists arrived in New England in the early 1600s, they found what looked like an empty wilderness. But it wasn't empty. It was a graveyard. They were walking through the ruins of a holocaust. And here's the most disturbing part. Some colonists knew exactly what was happening and saw it as divine providence. They believed God was clearing the land for them. Some even called the diseases a wonderful plague sent by God to make room for Christian settlers. Later, there's evidence that British colonists intentionally spread disease by giving indigenous people blankets infected with smallpox. Biological warfare, centuries before the term existed. Now, let's talk about the pilgrims. Because the Thanksgiving story you learned is basically fiction designed to make you feel good about colonization. The Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts in December 1620 aboard the Mayflower. They were English separatists, religious extremists who'd been kicked out of England and then kicked out of Holland for being too radical even for other Protestants. They were not fleeing religious persecution in the way you were taught. They left because they wanted to create a society so strictly religious that even other Christians found it oppressive. They landed at Plymouth, and here's what they don't tell you. The only reason there was a clear area to settle was because a plague, likely smallpox brought by earlier European traders, had wiped out the Wampanoag village that had been there. The Pilgrims literally built their colony on top of indigenous graves, sometimes digging up burial sites to steal corn and supplies that had been buried with the dead. That first winter, half the Pilgrims died. They would have all died if not for Tisquantum, known as Squanto, a Patuxet man who had an incredible and tragic story. Squanto had been kidnapped by English traders years earlier, sold into slavery in Spain, escaped to England, learned English, and finally made his way back home only to find his entire village dead from disease. He was possibly the last surviving member of his people. Despite everything Europeans had done to him, Squanto helped the Pilgrims. He taught them how to plant corn, where to fish, how to survive. The Wampanoag leader Massasoit made a treaty with the Pilgrims, providing them with food and protection. Without indigenous help, the Plymouth colony would have failed completely. And how did the Pilgrims repay this kindness? Within a generation, they were massacring the same people who'd saved them. In 1637, English colonists surrounded a Pequot village at Mystic, set it on fire, and shot anyone who tried to escape. They killed between 400 and 700 people, mostly women, children, and elderly, because the warriors were away. The colonial governor, William Bradford, described the scene with satisfaction, writing about how the fire made them fry and praising God for delivering their enemies into their hands. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was policy. The English had learned from Spanish colonization in Central and South America that terrorism worked. Massacre a village brutally enough, and other communities would be too terrified to resist. It was a strategy of conquest through fear. Now let's talk about the other European powers colonizing North America, because it wasn't just the English. This is where the story gets even more complex. Spain claimed most of Central and South America plus Florida and the Southwest. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro toppled the Aztec and Inca empires through a combination of military technology, indigenous alliances with enemies of those empires, and disease. The Spanish established a colonial system based on forced labor, slavery, and extraction of gold and silver. They brought Catholic missionaries who destroyed indigenous religious sites and forced conversions. Millions died in Spanish silver mines, worked to death in conditions of absolute horror. France claimed a huge swath of North America, from Canada down through the Mississippi River Valley to Louisiana. French colonization was different from Spanish or English. The French were more interested in the fur trade than settlement, which meant they often formed alliances and trading partnerships with indigenous nations. French traders married indigenous women. There was more cultural exchange, though let's be clear, the French still brought disease, still disrupted indigenous societies, and still ultimately saw themselves as superior and indigenous people as subjects to be converted to Christianity. The Dutch claimed New Netherland, which included present-day New York. They were primarily interested in trade, especially beaver pelts, which were worth a fortune in Europe. The Dutch established New Amsterdam, which would later become New York City after the English seized it. The Dutch were probably the most pragmatic and least ideologically driven of the colonizers. They wanted profit, not necessarily territory or Christian converts, though they got involved in their share of violence when it served their interests. And Sweden briefly had a colony in Delaware, though it was absorbed by the Dutch and then the English fairly quickly. All of these European powers were competing with each other, while simultaneously conquering indigenous lands. They formed alliances with different indigenous nations, who were themselves navigating a rapidly changing and increasingly dangerous world. Indigenous people weren't passive victims. They were active participants trying to survive by playing European powers against each other, forming their own alliances, and resisting when they could. But they were facing an impossible situation. The diseases kept coming. The Europeans kept arriving in greater numbers, and the Europeans had certain technological advantages, particularly in metallurgy and guns, that made military resistance increasingly difficult. Here's another hidden fact. Slavery in America didn't start with Africans. It started with indigenous people. Columbus enslaved Taino people. Spanish colonists enslaved indigenous people throughout their territories. English colonists in New England enslaved Pequot people after the Mystic Massacre, shipping them to the Caribbean to be sold. Indigenous slavery was widespread in early colonial America, but indigenous people had certain advantages that made them difficult to enslave long-term. They knew the land. They could escape and disappear into territories Europeans didn't control. They had communities and nations that would fight to free enslaved members, and they were dying from disease at such catastrophic rates that they couldn't provide a stable labor force. So the colonists turned to Africa. The Atlantic slave trade began in the 1500s and would eventually transport over 12 million Africans to the Americas in one of history's greatest crimes against humanity. But that's a whole other story. For now, just know that the colonization of America was built on two simultaneous genocides: the destruction of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of African peoples. By the mid-1600s, English colonization was accelerating. More colonies were established. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, each had different origins and purposes. Some were founded for religious reasons, like Massachusetts by Puritans seeking to build their city upon a hill, a theocratic society that would be an example to the world. Others, like Virginia, were primarily economic ventures, established by joint stock companies looking to extract wealth. The Virginia Company established Jamestown in 1607, and it nearly failed immediately. The colonists spent their first year searching for gold instead of planting crops. They were starving and dying of disease. They survived largely because of trade with the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan, whose daughter Pocahontas you've probably heard of. But the real story of Pocahontas is nothing like the Disney version. Pocahontas was a child, probably around 10 or 11, when she met John Smith. There was no romance. Years later, English colonists kidnapped her, held her hostage, forced her to convert to Christianity, changed her name to Rebecca, and married her off to an English colonist named John Rolfe as part of a peace treaty. She was taken to England as a propaganda tool to show that indigenous people could be civilized, and she died there at around age 21, probably from disease, never having returned home. Her story is not romantic, it's tragic and exploitative. Virginia eventually found its cash crop, tobacco. Tobacco was incredibly profitable, and it required massive amounts of land and labor. This drove English expansion into Powhatan territory, which led to wars, massacres, and eventually the near destruction of the Powhatan Confederacy. By the late 1600s, English colonists had pushed indigenous peoples away from the coast and were expanding inland. This pattern repeated throughout colonial America. Make contact, establish trade. Colonists want more land. Tensions rise. War breaks out. Indigenous people are massacred or pushed further inland. Colonists expand into newly empty territory. Rinse and repeat for 200 years. But here's something they don't teach. Indigenous people won many of these conflicts, at least temporarily. King Philip's War in 1675 and 1676 was one of the bloodiest per capita conflicts in American history. Metacom, called King Philip by the English, was a Wampanoag leader who united multiple indigenous nations in a massive uprising against New England colonists. The indigenous forces destroyed dozens of English towns and killed thousands of colonists. For a while, it looked like they might actually drive the English out entirely, but the English had more resources, more reinforcements from Europe, and alliances with other indigenous nations who had their own rivalries with the Wampanoag. The war ended with Metacom's death, his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years, his wife and children sold into slavery in the Caribbean, and his people nearly destroyed. The colonists celebrated it as divine victory. The indigenous survivors remembered it as another step toward extinction. By the early 1700s, there were 13 established English colonies along the Atlantic coast. They were growing rapidly, fueled by immigration from Europe and enslaved labor from Africa. The colonists were developing their own identity, distinct from England but built on ideas of white supremacy, land ownership, and expansionism. And here's a crucial hidden fact. The colonists didn't see themselves as stealing land because they didn't believe indigenous people had legitimate ownership. European legal theory at the time held that land belonged to whoever improved it through agriculture and settlement. Indigenous people's relationship with land, which often involved seasonal movement, hunting, and less intensive agriculture, didn't count in European eyes. The English invoked the doctrine of discovery, a legal framework that said Christian Europeans had the right to claim lands inhabited by non-Christians. This wasn't a misunderstanding or cultural difference. It was a legal justification for theft. The colonists knew indigenous people lived on the land, had territories, and had done so for thousands of years. They just decided that didn't matter. The French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763, called the 7 Years' War in Europe, was a massive conflict between Britain and France, with various indigenous nations allied with both sides. Britain won, gaining control of French territory in Canada and east of the Mississippi River. But the war was expensive, and Britain expected the American colonies to help pay for it through taxes. The colonists refused, arguing they shouldn't be taxed without representation in Parliament. This led directly to the American Revolution. But here's the hidden context. One reason colonists wanted independence was that the British government, trying to avoid more costly wars with indigenous nations, had prohibited colonial expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists wanted that land. They wanted to keep expanding, keep taking indigenous territory, and the British government was in their way. So when you hear about the American Revolution being fought for freedom and liberty, remember that part of the freedom they wanted was the freedom to continue colonizing indigenous lands without British interference. The Declaration of Independence, that beautiful document about all men being created equal, was written by slaveholders and included a grievance against King George for the merciless Indian savages who attacked frontier settlements, the savages defending their own land from invasion. After the Revolution, the new United States continued the colonization project with even more vigor. Thomas Jefferson, despite his eloquent words about equality, believed indigenous people would either assimilate completely into white culture or be pushed west of the Mississippi. Andrew Jackson, celebrated as a hero for decades, orchestrated the Trail of Tears, forcing tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people from their homelands in the southeast to Oklahoma in the 1,830 seconds. Thousands died on the journey. This was ethnic cleansing, plain and simple, and it was official U.S. government policy. The pattern continued all the way through the 1800s. Manifest destiny, the idea that Americans had a God-given right to expand across the continent, was the ideological justification for continued genocide. The California Gold Rush led to the near extermination of indigenous Californians. The U.S. cavalry fought countless wars against Plains nations. The buffalo, which sustained Plains cultures, were hunted nearly to extinction specifically to destroy indigenous ways of life. By 1890, the indigenous population of the United States had been reduced to less than 250,000, down from millions. Reservations were created, not as gifts, but as concentration camps where indigenous people were confined to the worst land, prevented from practicing their cultures, and subjected to forced assimilation. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their languages, forced to adopt Christianity, and taught that their cultures were inferior. The last of these schools didn't close until the 1,970 seconds. This is the real history of American colonization. Not pilgrims and Indians sharing a meal in harmony, but centuries of systematic violence, theft, disease, and genocide. It's estimated that the indigenous population of the Americas declined by over 90% between 1,492 and 1,900. 90%. That's somewhere between 50 and 90 million people. It is, by any measure, one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. And yet we built a country on top of it and told ourselves it was destiny, that it was progress, that it was civilization triumphing over savagery. We named sports teams after the people we destroyed. We put the faces of men who orchestrated genocide on our currency and carved them into mountains. We turned history into mythology, villains into heroes, and victims into footnotes. Here's what they never tell you in school. The United States was not a virgin wilderness transformed into a great nation. It was a densely populated land stolen through violence and disease. American democracy was not built from nothing. It was influenced by indigenous confederacies that had practiced democratic governance for centuries before Europeans arrived. American wealth was not created by hard work alone. It was extracted from stolen land using enslaved labor. The colonization of America was not an inevitable march of progress. It was a choice, made over and over again for centuries, to prioritize European expansion over indigenous lives. And the consequences of those choices are still with us today. Indigenous peoples still exist, despite everything done to destroy them. But they live disproportionately in poverty, on land nobody else wanted, with rates of disease, addiction, and suicide that reflect intergenerational trauma. Treaties that guaranteed their rights are routinely violated. Their lands are still being taken for pipelines, mining, and development. The history of American colonization is not ancient history. It's ongoing, and until we confront the full truth of what was done, who did it, why they did it, and how we still benefit from it today, we'll never fully understand America. So let's be clear about the hidden facts they don't want you to know. Christopher Columbus was not a hero. He was a brutal colonizer who began a holocaust. The Pilgrims were not peaceful settlers. They were religious extremists who built their colony on indigenous graves and repaid kindness with massacre. Manifest destiny was not divine will. It was propaganda justifying genocide. And the United States was not founded on empty wilderness. It was built on stolen land, using enslaved labor. The people who played roles in this story are not just the famous colonizers whose names you know: Columbus, Cortez, Pizarro, John Smith, William Bradford, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson. They're also the indigenous leaders who resisted: Metacom, Tecumseh, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Geronimo. And they're the millions of ordinary indigenous people whose names we'll never know, who survived disease, violence, and cultural destruction to ensure their people's survival. The countries involved were not just England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands. They were also the indigenous nations that existed before colonization: the Taino, the Powhatan Confederacy, the Wampanoag, the Pequot, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Cherokee Nation, the Lakota, the Apache, and hundreds of others, each with their own governments, territories, languages, and cultures. This is the shocking truth about how America was colonized. It's not a story of brave explorers discovering a new world. It's a story of invasion, conquest, disease, slavery, and genocide on a scale almost unmatched in human history. It's a story of indigenous resistance and survival against impossible odds, and it's a story that's still being written today. If this video has opened your eyes to the real history of American colonization, hit that subscribe button and share this with everyone you know. The truth matters. History matters. We can't change the past, but we can stop lying about it. We can honor the memory of those who died. We can recognize the ongoing struggles of indigenous people. And we can build a future that acknowledges the truth instead of hiding behind comfortable myths. The colonization of America was not destiny. It was a choice. Every day, we choose whether to confront that history honestly or to keep repeating the lies that make us comfortable. What choice will you make?